We've been moving in kind of larger chunks as we cover the narrative. As if we're doing an Old Testament book. We've done this in the past with Job, and we've been working through Genesis for a little over 2 years now. But we're going to focus on one verse today. Okay, one verse we're going to take. But the idea in the verse is profound and one that we should take to heart. Okay, too often, especially when we're reading a narrative, we can get lost in the overall scope of what's going on in the story and not contemplate the truths that are being conveyed that God has chosen to convey to us by His Spirit as He works through the authors of Scripture to teach us. Okay, so we're going to look at chapter 35, verse 5 this morning, and then we're going to dissect the idea that is being conveyed to us and how it ministers to us even today. So, verse 5 says this, "And as they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob." Now, what this is referencing is what has happened previously in the story, in that Simeon and Levi, two of Jacob's sons, had slaughtered an entire city because of what the son, the prince of the city, had done to their sister Dinah. He had shamed her. Okay, he had been inappropriate with her. And then he had the audacity, after doing such a thing, to ask that she be given to him in marriage. Simeon and Levi answered and said, "You know what, we'll give her if you'll do this thing. If you'll circumcise all the men in your city, then we can give her to you, and because otherwise we can't." And they agreed, and so they did. And the day that they were sore, the third day, Simeon and Levi came through and slaughtered all the males. Now, Jacob's fear was that would then turn the surrounding cities against Jacob, because it was just his family. Jacob had come from Laban. He was traveling. He had settled a little bit in Shechem, and now they're living amongst his people, but they're still kind of separate. They're not integrated into the tribe because they're not worshiping the same God that they are worshiping. They're different. They're outsiders. They're living outside of the city, but they're still associated with the city. So they have the kind of like we do with Fort Worth, right? We're still kind of out from everybody. We're different, but we still can get to Fort Worth if we want to have some fun, right? Okay? Right? Okay, so that's kind of how Jacob was living near Shechem. Okay? But then Simeon and Levi slaughtered everybody. Right? But there's not an overall government. There's not an overall king for him to say, we were just in doing this. There was no protection for them. He's the small band, just his family, his sons, and their servants. If anybody were to attack them, they were probably going to get slaughtered themselves. So Jacob is concerned. Okay, but God calls them then to leave Shechem and to go down to Bethel, which is where Jacob had first experienced seeing the angels descending and ascending into heaven and from onto earth and all these things. He said, this is the place where God lives. So God calls them, it's about 30-mile journey. Okay, but that's journey through wilderness. That's not journey with protection. And so Jacob was afraid. And indeed, what we would probably assume is that Shechem and his father Hamor had probably not traveled very far from their kinfolk in order to establish Shechem. There were probably relatives not far away that would have sought vengeance for what Simeon and Levi had done. Not to mention just the general atmosphere of probably wanting a form of justice, or knowing that these people were vulnerable, knowing that now this has happened, and now we're going to punish this group because they have disrupted the peace of the area. There's all kinds of reasons why we can think why Jacob would be afraid because of what his sons had done. It happens that it was for good reason. Because I want us to notice something about what is given to us in this verse. And as they journey, so they're journeying from Shechem to Bethel, a terror from God fell upon the cities. Now, this is not something that probably would have been known without God having revealed it. Right? They wouldn't have gone and interviewed every city on their way and be like, hey, are you afraid of us? Yes, we are. God said we should be. This is, in fact, something that God conveyed to the writer of Genesis, Moses, upon his recording God's work in the lives of the people of Israel. That God would have specifically said, you need to know I caused the safety of Jacob as he traveled from Shechem to Bethel. Now, we generally know that God does not do something for no reason. God wouldn't tell us he caused this great terror if there wasn't a reason for him to cause this terror. So it's reasonable to assume, even though it's not stated in the text, that there were those who were perhaps even preparing to go after Jacob. Maybe had already eyed him, but he was under the safety of Shechem, and now that Shechem was no longer in play, they were going to make a play for Jacob and his riches, because he had come from Laban with a lot of stuff. But God intervened and shifted the hearts of those who were going to take opportunity to harm God's people and instead made them afraid. God would not point out his action in this if they were just indifferent, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense. If the people were just going to let Jacob go, why would God point out that he caused the terror that kept people away from Jacob? So something we need to take note of. God shifted the hearts of godless, greedy, violent people to protect his own. Think about that for just a second. God changed the hearts of violent, greedy, godless people to protect his own. Now, I don't know about you, but there are a lot of times in this life and in this world where I feel like things are kind of out of control when it comes to good things. That there are bad guys who prowl and they are out there and they will do harm all of the time. Unchecked. They don't have any regard for police or laws or anything else. There are a lot of times that we as Christians, especially if we watch the news quite a bit, where we can feel like everything's moving out of control. And indeed, to a degree, that's true. When sin is in play, to us especially, and how we perceive things and the limited scope that we have, it can certainly feel like things are getting worse, things are getting bad, all of those things that we tend to feel. And yet here God proves once again, even those who seem to be uncontrollable, the lawless, the godless, the violent, God can, and when he so chooses, manipulate their hearts so that they do not do what they are prone to do. This is something that is significant for us as we look at our lives. Because how often are we driven by anxiety in what we feel we cannot control? And when I say driven, I literally mean that our lives are literally being driven by the anxiety, the fear that something may happen to us, that something may happen to our church, that something may happen that nobody's in control over except for the bad guys. And God has over and over and over again, and here specifically, spoken to us specifically that He is in control of it all. There is not a single heart that He cannot bend to His will, especially when it comes to fulfilling His promise for His people. God literally, in this verse, shifted the hearts of cities in order to protect the family of Jacob as they slowly plodded along those 30 to 50 miles to get to Bethel. With all their sheep, with all their children, with all their goats, with all their stuff. God shifted the hearts of cities to protect His own. This is not a singular occurrence in the Scriptures. If you remember the story of Moses in Egypt, Moses and Pharaoh, the king of one of the greatest civilizations up until that point of history. And Pharaoh's heart was like putty in God's hands. Now we like to say, well, he rebelled against. Yeah. Pharaoh was Pharaoh. He didn't believe in God. Of course he's going to rebel. Of course he's going to harden his hearts for his own gain. But then here comes God, stating well beforehand, I'm going to harden his heart too. Even when he wants to give up, I'm not going to let him give up, because I am going to show myself glorious and powerful, and I am going to gain victory over Egypt. And so God does. Now, certainly there are times that the Scriptures tell us Pharaoh hardens his heart. He's stubborn. He doesn't want to let these people go. It's a tremendous workforce that he doesn't have to pay very much. But then there are the times where he's ready to relent, and God says, no, not yet. Harden your heart again, because I'm going to continue to show that I am God and you are not. You will not let them go until I've said it's time for them to go. God, throughout the Scriptures, has shown himself to be powerful over nations. Here in Genesis, he's powerful over cities and the hearts of the people in those cities. The question that I have to ask myself, that we should ask ourselves now, is why do we question him? Why do we, having the evidence of the Scriptures and what he has done in conquering sin and death, why do we still wonder whether or not he's there, whether or not he's in control, whether or not he will provide? Over my life of walking with the Lord, there have been certain moments in my life where the Lord has really shown me, not that I am asking the wrong questions, but I'm wrongly asking questions. Okay? It's not that I'm asking the wrong questions. Some of the questions may sound right, may feel right, but I'm wrongly asking, why do I feel like I should have the right to ask of God why he has done what he has done, being God? Many of us, we get lost in doldrums in our spiritual life. When I mean like we just feel like we're just drifting aimlessly. Like God's not answering, God's not speaking, God's not doing enough. We get to those places because we are wrongly asking questions of God and then holding on to demand that he answer questions we should never have asked in the first place. Think back to Job. Job was a man blameless and upright before the Lord. If anybody deserved to have the blessings that Job had with his 10 children and with all of his riches and with his influence in his community, Job was the one, because Job was blameless as God spoke of him. And yet, he lost it all. Not only did he lose all of his riches, he also lost all of his influence. And not only that, then he lost his health. In a span of time, Job lost literally everything that he counted as blessing from God. So naturally, Job does what any human with any type of understanding would do. He starts asking questions and demanding of God that God meet him to answer the questions. And God does show up and answers none of his questions. God simply shows up and says, I am who I am. Who are you? Brothers and sisters, sometimes it's not that we need an answer from God. Most often it is that we simply need Him. So what we must ask ourselves this morning are the things that are causing us most anxiety in our lives really things that need to be answered, or do we need to remember that we serve a God who holds the hearts of all of mankind in His hand and can turn them whatever way He will? What would seem impossible to us is completely possible with God. There is nothing outside of His control. Have you surrendered to that truth? Because I will tell you, there is no greater rest that comes for us than trusting God to be God. For His plan to be the plan that we're going by. But I don't know about you, I keep making them, right? I keep making plans. Right? Don't we? We keep making plans and we keep working. And there's nothing wrong with trying to plan ahead. There's nothing wrong with being responsible for your moment today in hopes that that builds on what you need for tomorrow. There's nothing wrong with those types of things. But if we become so married to these plans that we assume that they must be God's as well until He takes a hard left turn and things that we never planned on, and we come to realize in those moments that our faith was not in the God who was in control, but the plans that we had made. So we find ourselves lost. How could God, like Job, we thought we were moving on a really good clip. We thought we were doing everything right, that you were blessing all of our goodness because we're so good. Until He brings us back to the truth that it's not about what we've received from Him, but that we have received Him. And there is no greater comfort for the child of God than knowing that God is God, not us. Another story that is miraculous in the Scriptures, one that defies a lot of what we would count as understanding. It's found in 2 Kings. For the northern kingdom of Israel, they were constantly being bombarded by the Assyrians, or the Syrians. They were enemies. They worshipped another god. They had a whole other concept of what right and wrong should be. They had all these everything. They were constantly in conflict. And then in the midst of all of this, as it's kind of been a theme throughout the northern kingdom of Israel, we have this story of this general named Naaman who contracts leprosy, which was never a good thing in ancient times, has no idea what to do, no hope of getting it cured. Now his whole career is at stake. All the influence that he has in his community is all going to be washed away because he's going to have to be relegated to this place outside of everything else so he doesn't spread it to everybody. His time with the king is going to be null. He's not going to be able to lead armies anymore. All of these things that he's going to lose because he now has leprosy. And he hears from his little servant girl through his wife, there's a God in Israel. There's a God who is not just worshipped. He's not this pillar of stone that you go and make a sacrifice. He is a living God who controls diseases. And so Naaman, in his Syrian mindset, thinks, you know what? I'm going to bring offerings to this God. I'm going to let them know I'm coming to be healed. And I'm going to bring all this stuff and all this pomp. And I'm going to buy my way into this God's good grace because that's how this must work. So he comes to Elisha the prophet. Elisha doesn't even come out to him. He sends his servant. Right? Naaman's coming with all this pomp, with all this stuff, with all these riches. Like, I'm going to show this prophet that I mean business. And the prophet doesn't even come out to see him. But he says, you know what? Go and dip yourself in the Jordan River 7 times. That's what God says for you, Naaman. Go take a little dip in the Jordan River. What's Naaman's response? What? The Jordan is muddy. It's dirty. We have better rivers that I could have washed in if this was just a hygiene issue. So Naaman storms off. He's on his way back to Syria. He's got all his stuff. He's in a huff. And his servant's like, okay, time out. You came all this way with all this stuff to get healed. And the dude says, just dip 7 times in this muddy river and you'll be healed, and you're going to walk all the way back to Syria? So Naaman's like, he gets in the water, he dips 7 times. What happens? He's healed. Because was it about the Jordan River? I've been to the Jordan River. I've dunked myself in the Jordan River. Nothing magical happened. I was pretty disappointed. Obviously, I wasn't going to do anything magical. It was just neat to be there, right? But it's muddy. It's ugly. It's not a place that you go to because of all this vast beauty or how clean it is throughout the year. I can see why Naaman didn't want to get into it. But what is it really about, the Jordan River? No, it was about God being God. And we know that not just because Naaman was healed, but as Naaman comes out and is cleansed of his leprosy, his heart was also cleansed. Naaman returns to Elisha, trying to pay off the debt he now feels for his silliness and his healing. And Elisha says, I don't want any of it. God has healed you, and he doesn't need your stuff. And Naaman's heart is so moved and so changed, he says, listen, I'm only worshiping this God. Because the God of my homeland couldn't do anything for me. No matter how many gods we had, no matter how many shekels I threw at him, no matter how much gold and silver and changes of clothes I gave, he could do nothing for me. But your God has healed me. And I will worship no other God. In fact, I want your dirt. I want his dirt, okay? Because really it's not about the dirt of Israel, but he's thinking this is God's land, because that's how they thought back then. To have a specific part of land that was part of that nation meant it belonged to a God. And he says, I want the earth of this God, so that when I worship on what is his and what he has blessed. So they send him away with a bunch of dirt and a new heart. The Syrian general, who had probably on multiple occasions invaded and raided and plundered and murdered the people of God, God gave him a new heart. Talk about a turnaround, right? The enemy of God's people becomes one of God's people. And you're worried about whether or not he can provide for you? And you're worried about what people think of you? And you're worried about so many other things that are absolutely in God's control, as if he is not who he says he is. God, again, has done this on multiple occasions. We see it in the stories of the kings of Judah, whenever this great horde comes before Jehoshaphat. And Jehoshaphat prays that wonderful prayer that if you haven't prayed it yourself, you should start. Lord, we don't know what to do, but our eyes are on you. So Jehoshaphat gets his army all together. They go to faces where they're outnumbered 1,000 to 1. They get out there and they don't even have to fight, because they slaughtered each other in the night, because God's that big. Or Hezekiah, whenever Sennacherib and all of his armies are coming against Jerusalem, they're ready to besiege, and they've conquered all the way to Jerusalem. And Hezekiah's like, we don't know what to do, so God, here they are. You've heard their taunts. You've heard what they said about you. You've heard about how they talk about you to our people and amongst themselves. So God, here, do something for your name. And God said, they're not even going to step foot in here. Not even going to shoot an arrow. I am going to send them back to their own land, and they won't come back. I don't know about you, but military campaigns throughout history, it's like one of the things that armies don't just move quickly. Right? Especially if they've gotten all the way to a place and ready to conquer it and they know that they can take it. They don't just kind of up and like, oh, you know what, we're done here. That's fine. We don't really need this nice city with all of its stuff. That doesn't happen. But how does God say he's going to save Jerusalem? Don't worry. Tomorrow they're going to hear a rumor. That's how God's going to defeat this whole big army, with a rumor. That they're going to leave this whole city that they just conquered and fought and pillaged and all this stuff. They're going to, yep. And just like God said, the very next day, that whole army was gone. One of my favorite things is that the guy who was like the herald of the great king from Assyria, who was talking so much trash about don't listen to Hezekiah and all this stuff he's saying about trusting God, he's still mouthing off as he's walking away. Don't you believe that God's going to send us away? We'll be right back. No, you won't. God has proven over and over and over and over again, he will control nations, he will control the hearts of humanity, and he will move them on behalf of his children. Why are you afraid? John chapter 9. See another example of things so far outside of human control, or seemingly, we sometimes like to create ways of feeling in control for things. In John chapter 9, we read the story of the man born blind. The man born blind. So the disciples in the religion of the day, they had made up and they had believed the system of control that mankind had to prove that there's a reason why this happens. It doesn't just randomly happen. It's just there's a reason this happened. And it's probably because these people are bad people. So the disciples in that lane ask, who sinned that this guy was born blind? Was it his parents or was it him? Because don't we do that with things that are outside of our control? Don't we like to fit it into a system that feels like we've got control of it? Right? And especially if it happens to somebody else, we like to create reasons why it's their fault. So that we feel kind of in control. We know, and as long as we don't do that same thing, then we're good. And we usually try and pick things for other people that are things that we don't have any issues with. But Jesus says, guys, it's not about what somebody did. It's about God wanting to show His glory. And Jesus heals the man. The man born blind, Jesus heals. And the guy even tells the Pharisees, who's ever heard of somebody healing a man born blind? Because most likely up until that point, there had been they had found reasons why people go blind, right? And that we could heal that, right? They get a certain disease in their eyes, we can maybe heal that, clear that up, right? So they'd heard of people who had gone blind, had sight, and then they'd gone blind in the past. But somebody born blind, somebody who never had sight at all, don't even know why, right? Which is why they have to create, obviously their parents sinned, that's why the kid's born blind. What horrible parents, right? Obviously this kid did something to make God mad at him while he was in the womb or on his way out or something, I don't know. I don't know how that one would work in their minds. But obviously, he maybe did something. If the parents didn't. Born blind. Man, must be a bad person. But Jesus, to show the power of God over things that we can't control, and certainly things we don't understand, healed the man born blind. And as if that wasn't enough, not long after that, Jesus hears of his friend Lazarus being sick. Jesus had been healing the sick. That's like his MO, right? You're sick, you're around Jesus, bam, you're good. Right? So they send to Jesus with plenty of time for him to get there, heal Lazarus, all good. Jesus doesn't go. Lazarus dies. Jesus let Lazarus die to show us that the worst thing that could happen to us in our lives, i.e. death, even that, he has full control over. The worst thing that we can imagine, us dying before our time. That's how we think of it. That's not what actually happens. There's not anybody who has died early. Let's be clear on something. But the thing that we fear most, right? Death. Jesus comes and he cures it. By his word. He doesn't come and give this fancy, he doesn't even lay hands on it. He just calls him out. He wakes him up. What are you afraid of as you serve a God who speaks to death and it leaves? What is so big in your life that's bigger than dying for you to continue to justify not trusting God? God has proved over and over and over again His ability to conquer, to command, to control anything that's necessary to fulfill His promises to His people. Why are you afraid? Now, another area that for us becomes a common stumbling block is when it comes to telling others about our God. Because see, when Christ saved us, He didn't save us just to hoard His love, but He saved us to be ambassadors for Christ, pleading with a lost and dying world to come to God, testifying of His goodness to us in what He has done on our behalf through the person of Jesus Christ. And yet so many of us are deathly afraid to share the gospel with people. We don't want to do it. We know we should, but we have all of these reasons why we don't. Many of them surrounding what people are going to think, or the fact that we have not seen God change people's hearts fast enough. Or there's some people that we've tried to reach that they just don't want to believe. And that's why God gave us Paul. Paul the Apostle. We have never, or I won't say never, most of us have not met somebody who would be as adverse to Christ as Paul was. I don't know about you, but I don't run into a lot of people in Cleburne, Texas, or even in Texas in general, who have killed somebody because they were a Christian and felt like that was a good job. Paul in 1 Timothy calls himself an insolent opponent. Okay, that phrase in the Greek means that it doesn't matter what you say, I'm not buying it, and I'm opposing everything you say. Right? It's like, you've had those arguments, with maybe it's with your spouse or maybe it's with a sibling or something. You know you're wrong, but you're never going to admit it. That's an insolent opponent, right? Like, it doesn't matter what you prove, doesn't matter what you say, doesn't matter how you treat me, I am not moving. That's Paul. Before Christ. And then there was that one moment where Jesus showed up. He didn't ask Paul to make a decision. He didn't present an argument as to why Paul was wasting his life pursuing Christians. He didn't plead with Paul. He simply said, "You're mine now." Jesus shows up. Says, "Paul, why are you persecuting me? You know what? I'm going to send you out. and I'll show you how much you're going to suffer for my name. And you're going to receive a joy that's greater than that suffering, to where you will endure even more suffering. You will be willing to go into suffering because you're mine. And there's something better that I give to you. That one moment where Jesus stepped in changed everything. The heart of the most insolent opponent, the terrorist against Christianity, was changed in one moment because Jesus showed up. What are you afraid of? Who are you afraid of? What is it you think God can't control? That is continually causing this anxiety in you. And listen, folks, we have a lot of reasonable things in this room this morning. There are a lot of things that, looking with human eyes, that this morning should cause us to feel fear, to feel anxious, to feel out of control, to feel like we can't do enough. The message we have from Genesis 35:5, right? Everybody's favorite verse. You have it on a coffee cup? Probably not. What God is telling us, telling you to your heart this morning, don't be anxious. There is nothing outside of my control. And I can, with a word or in a moment, change the trajectory of everything. But if I don't, there is a reason. There is joy. There is peace. There is rest to be had, even in the midst of whatever may be going on. That to our minds would set off the alarm bells. Worry, 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 worry. The same God who shifted the hearts of those cities has control of your life. Do not be afraid. Don't worry about what the next moment or tomorrow might bring. The God who has named the stars knows your name as well. The God who considers the loss of a single sparrow as worthy of his attention has his eyes on you. And maybe it's not that you need more answers to have peace, but maybe it is that you need more of him. This morning, put your faith in him. Trust him for what you are going through. Believe that whatever you may be going through, he will use for your good and for his glory. As you continually put your faith in him in the moments where it looks like you should be afraid. I love the verse spoken to wives in particular because they have a lot of trusting to do in a marriage relationship, especially with a fool of a husband. When he says, listen, don't be afraid of the things that are frightening. I love that he puts it that way because that helps our hearts to know that we're not just cowards. There are things that are scary out there. So let's not pretend, even this morning, as we're talking about putting our faith and hope and not being anxious, that there aren't things out there that are frightening for us. But the reason we don't have to be afraid even of the things that are frightening is because we are connected and secure in the God who is in control even of the frightening things. And that there is not a single thing that happens in this life outside of his control. So rest, sons and daughters of God. Don't be afraid. The God who spoke creation into existence has also spoken to you, shined his light in your heart, that you may overcome the fear that threatens to control us. So this morning, once again, put your faith in the promises of God for you. There is nothing that can separate you from the love of God in Christ Jesus. Nothing. What you are enduring right now is not God judging you for not loving him. He has not removed his love from you. Hold tightly to his promises as you walk with him. And be ready to give his love away. Don't get lost in the anxiety of a moment that you forget to see the souls around you who need to see God's love in you, no matter what you're going through. He is faithful, and he will not fail. You can trust him. I want to take this moment now and give you time to speak with God. Maybe you have come in this morning with a lot of anxiety about what tomorrow may hold or the future may hold. You come in with the anxiety of what this week has held for you. You come in believing your life to be very controlled. Or maybe you've been asking a lot of questions of God and he hasn't quite given you the answers that you wanted. I don't know what it is for you this morning, but I do know this. That the great God of the universe has told us to come just as we are. Full of our anxieties, full of our worries, full of our cares. He tells you to come now. And lay those burdens at his feet. And find rest. And find peace. And remember why we thank him even when the storm hits. So maybe this morning you need to confess anxieties. Maybe this morning you just need to thank him because you haven't done that this week because you've been so afraid of what's going on. You haven't remembered to be thankful. Whatever it may be for you this morning, just take time to spend with him. And then we'll sing together again. Praises to our God who is worthy. No matter what storm may be raging. He is worthy. Talk to the Lord now. And then we'll sing.